Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'd like to welcome you to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and I'd like to welcome our viewers from around the world to this series of conversations by global experts on perhaps the most consequential foreign policy issue of the 21st century, the relationship between China and the United States. The series is being held under the auspices of the Foreign Policy Association, which will publish a report on these proceedings later this summer, under the title of A China Agenda for the Biden Administration. With a new American president, there is an opportunity to recalibrate or fine-tune U.S. strategy for China to reflect today's reality, to try and help stop the slide and the dangerous competition between today's two superpowers, China and the United States. Today, I have the great pleasure of bringing on stage to talk with me one of the big view thinkers on policy, Dr. Parag Khanna, who I will now introduce. So, Dr. Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Dr. Parag's newest book is The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. He's the author of numerous books, including a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, followed by How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance, and concluding with Connectography. Dr. Khanna was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He earned a PhD from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's and master's degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's traveled to nearly 150 countries, and I think I'm safe in saying that we catch him in his hometown of Singapore today. So welcome, please, Dr. Parag Khanna from Singapore.
Hello, Sarwar.
Nice to see you. Parag, how are you today?
Very well, thank you. As you can see, I am on the other side of the world. It's dark here, and I am in Singapore.
You don't have a few inches of snow where you are, do you?
No snow. Something my kids always regret and lament.
You have one of these theme parks where you can go skiing in Singapore?
They've added a little ice world type of thing where they've got sort of fake snowmen and sledding. Not quite the same thing because we do remember Europe and the Northeast, so we know what real snow is like.
Oh gosh, listen, I'm going to get right into. I have a series of things to talk to you about, and you are one of the most knowledgeable people on grand strategy, global order. And you're a close observer of what's happening in Asia, especially. So let me start with this. If I was walking down an Asian country street today, Malaysia, Philippines, Cambodia, and I stopped a person and I said, "Hey, what are you thinking these days about democracy in America?" What do you think they would say?
Well, they'd be confused. I think you raise a very, very important question, and my answer might be slightly unorthodox, because I think we can dispense quickly with what we already know from the general reportage that has come out of the region, which is that, an older group of people say, we remember when America was a shining light and we're so horrified to see, the tragic events in the Capitol on January the 6th, and in general, the populist demagoguery and this kind of thing. Let's put that aside. The point that I would emphasize is one that doesn't get stated nearly enough, which is that most of the human population is under the age of 40. They have absolutely no tangible, personal, direct memory of the Cold War, even of 1990s triumphalism of Western liberal democracy over the Union and communism. So their frame of reference with respect to America has nothing to do with what you and I remember. To the extent they remember the US or think about the US at all, they think of the Iraq War, which was a failure. They think of the financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street. They think of the election of Donald Trump and these kinds of things. So the truth is that if most of the human population can't even relate to the sort of the real gap between what we generally think of from the sort of heyday versus today, it's pretty much all bad news if you think about it. It's immense power and awe in some ways of that power, certainly some admiration of Silicon Valley, but that's generally what young people think of. And I don't think enough researchers or journalists go around and target these questions simply at the largest segment of the human population, which is young Asians.
Right.
Young Asians, quite frankly, wouldn't have these nostalgic views the way you and I do because they don't have nostalgia.
Exactly. And so as they watched what happened last month, what do you think the young, the 40% were thinking, Parag?
Right. So, I mean, that's the demographic that I spend a lot of time with. And remember, I've characterized this as the kind of Anglo-American degeneration, right, and delegitimation. And its milestones include those of the last roughly 20 years. So again, to them, what's happening in the US isn't necessarily a huge surprise because what young people around the world have in common is to some degree this wokeness, right? So wherever they see that there have been these Black Lives Matters, protests, school shootings, all of these kinds of things, that is also a part and parcel of what they think of as America. So I think that, there was obviously this sense that, wow, they have Barack Obama as a president, having a minority figure run such a powerful country is a very highly respectable and praiseworthy anomaly, but he is governing a very divided and to some degree violent and a politically seemingly ungovernable society that's living on borrowed time, whose standards of living and so forth are based upon, fairly objective metrics have been going backwards to some degree. And I don't think that you can hide that information from people. You can't pretend that that's not what people see because that is what they see.
And how do you compare this? I have another question to look at this issue I just raised from another viewpoint, but I want to ask you, do you think that in a sense it's unfair, if I may use that word, because everyone can view the US and the disharmony and so on, but we cannot, at least that's the impression, view all of that from China. So do you think it's a little bit unfair, or do you think this idea that stuff in China never really gets out is not true?
Well, there's a couple of comments I'd make. The first is around the framework, because we've suddenly almost, sort of or unconsciously slipped into positing that there is a genuine bipolar intellectual competition between two prevailing models of governance in the world. I would reject that proposition entirely. And as you know, my entire first book was devoted to this issue of comparing the grand strategies of three prominent empires in the world: the United States, the European Union, and China.
Yes.
And really, anywhere you go in the world, most people would prefer to live under a European style of government, which is a social democratic welfare state with strong protections of individual liberty and all the way through your data protection through free healthcare and education. So there's no question as to what is the objectively, if you will, superior model of political form in the world, and it's not American, nor is it Chinese. Now, again, I live here in Asia amongst the 4.5 billion Asians, which is not to say I know every society intimately, but you will never find anyone who wants to live under a Chinese authoritarian dictatorship. So I don't know why we would posit this question in the first place.
Right.
If I can represent any particular demographic for the purposes of this conversation, it's the 3 billion Asians who are not Chinese. And I've never met any of them in the, let's say 40 plus years of my life that I've been Asian, and the last 20 years of traveling extensively within Asia, and the last 9 years of living in Asia. I've never met any one of these 3 billion people who says, I would love to live under a Chinese authoritarian dictatorship. Many of those 3 billion people would say it would be great to have high-speed rail. It would be great to have an innovative economy.
Right.
It would be great to be employed in a high-tech, special economic zone with a good job. It would be great to have materialism, law and order, public safety. But no one says, oh, yes, this social credit system is just wonderful. Wouldn't it be great if the government could confiscate my passport and ban me from traveling and forbid me from having a bank account and shut off that access because I said something critical, right? No one volunteers for that. So let's be absolutely clear that just because China is powerful, it doesn't mean that people view its political system as inherently legitimate and desirable. And these are concepts that should not be very difficult for us to differentiate. So it is not a bipolar intellectual system by any stretch of the imagination.
And that is such a critically important point that you have made, Parag, because it bears on what this series is all about, which is trying to formulate an agenda for the incoming administration on fresh thinking, U.S.-China foreign policy. And obviously at the heart of that is, or what has been, this idea in America that America is the torchbearer, and that other societies ought to mimic what America is all about, and therefore that we cannot coexist. We must oppose anything that is authoritarian. Do you think that idea itself needs some recalibration?
Well, the problem is, again, this sort of lack of a spectrum between the two ends, which is some kind of ideal type of a Western liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, as if there's nothing in between. And as you and I know, there's a very wide range of political systems that represent everything in between. And there are, especially Asia embodies all of those nuances. You have the world's foremost and most highly regarded and ranked and rated liberal democratic states here, whether it is Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, what Hong Kong used to be, Australia and New Zealand, that are obviously just geographically in this region, though culturally Western. So if you are looking for democratic models to emulate as a emergent, nascent, underdeveloped, or non-democratic Asian society, you have many role models right here in the region. And indeed, you would seek your technical assistance and your constitutional paradigms and these kinds of things, probably from one of those countries. And that is exactly what does happen. But, far be it for, sort of Western media to report on what Laos or Cambodia might be learning from Taiwan and South Korea. That's not exactly a sexy news story.
Yes.
It's much easier to say, the Statue of Liberty was paraded down the street in Vientiane.
Right.
But the fact is that one of the things I've always worked on when you look at social and political modernization is what I simply call the theory of the next best thing, right? What every country should aspire to is, what is that most proximate model that's one or two rungs ahead of where it is? And what can they learn from that, and move gradually up the ladder? So becoming the United States is not a viable proposition for just about any country in the world. But, for Afghanistan, it should look to Mongolia, right? Iraq should not look to Switzerland, right? And so you got to just take it one little step at a time. And Asia has this wide range of regimes. And I haven't yet mentioned, of course, Singapore. Now, Singapore is the radiant, if you will, metropole in this region, especially in light of what's been happening in Hong Kong. You won't really find many voices in Asia, not even in Singapore, quite frankly, that object to Singapore's, peculiar form of regime. It inherited parliamentary democracy, but one party clearly dominates. In the popular vote, however, it's much more distributed, and it's a governance model that's based on having an incredibly strong civil service that is impeccable in delivering public services and in listening constantly to the people, even if it was going to win every election and win, 99% of the seats, they would still do what they do, which is to listen to public sentiment, supportive, critical, constructive, and act upon most of the, if not all of the interests and will of the people. And so, that's something that may be news to some of your listeners, but to me, it's an utterly banal and obvious and boring fact of life in Asia, that the citizens in the government of India, the citizens in the government of Indonesia, the citizens in the government of the Philippines, and a dozen other countries in this region, whose combined population is upwards of 3 billion people, they already know this fact.
Yes.
That if they wish to be and become a large version of any particular other country, it would be Singapore. It would not be any other place. Now, this is something that, I reported on about 15 plus years ago when I was just a backpacker. So again, to me, just to state the obvious, this is just, it's not a debatable point, quite frankly, even if it's news to some people. And, we have an entire university here, aptly named the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which has for well over a decade been bringing in everyone from ministers to mayors and executives from every single country in the region, not least and notably, of course, China and India, to come and to study here to learn how to run a country. So when they go back to their countries, large and small, whether it's Kazakhstan or whether it is Papua New Guinea, again, the lessons that they are implementing are drawn straight from Singapore, not from Washington.
So let me ask you something that's down in the weeds a bit from what we've been talking about. Were you yourself surprised at how quickly, under the Trump administration, long established establishment policy, foreign policy in America, turned on a dime that almost turned 180 degrees? And my question doesn't have to do with Mr. Trump, but has to do with how strongly held were these beliefs and alliances. And I mean, were you surprised at how quickly things changed? And where I'm coming from, Parag, is if I was thinking about America, you mentioned this when we started out, let's wait. You mentioned something about other countries just saying, let's wait this out until Mr. Biden leaves. Don't you think countries are also thinking, well, what's the point of believing what they're doing now in Washington? Because 4 years from now, at the stroke of a pen, things can change.
Yes and no. I mean, there are certain structural alignments of interests between the United States and Asian powers. The more powerful China has become, the more it's self-evident that, to Japan and India and Australia and South Korea, that they do require American support to build the kinds of coalitions they need to constrain China or to retaliate or to ward off Chinese intimidation and so on. And so in that sense, that is something you would think of as a sort of structural alignment of interests that is going to persist across administrations.
Right.
And so that was true under the Trump administration, and that's why we speak of a certain degree, a high degree of continuity when it comes to Asia strategy when under the Biden administration. And I don't think necessarily a bad thing. However, how that is executed, I think is obviously the devil is in the details, because what I don't see is a kind of pan-Asian strategy coming out of Washington. It tends to be very China-centric, or Japan-centric to some degree. Again, and a lot of it is about vocabulary, right? So the new administration talks about a hub and spoke plus, or new hubs and new spokes, or one can't even keep track of all of the cliches. At the end of the day, it's about the pursuit of a multipolar Asia, and that is something that Asians fundamentally desire, certainly non-China Asians, and that's something that the U.S. needs to support. So if there is an embedded realization across administrations in the U.S. that a distributed equilibrium of power across Eurasia more broadly and in Asia is our consistent global interest, and that should be the fundamental pillar of our grand strategy, that would be a welcome thing. And it could well be that we are getting there. So irrespective of what happens in 2024 in the presidential election, depending on what happens with China, assuming a linear kind of trajectory of China's pursuit of its own interests, then you could well imagine that that will remain a consistent feature of U.S. diplomacy in the region. But again, that even in itself is really just table stakes, right? That just becomes a new baseline. But so much more has to be done in a much more sophisticated fashion for the vision to be implemented.
So now listen, a question on this new investment treaty between China and Europe. The way the papers here have played it, the media here has played it, is that the incoming Biden administration really wanted the EU to hold up this treaty till the new administration came into power, and that the Europeans just poo-pooed it because they know that their future is more with China when it comes to commerce and standards of living. Is that how, very quickly, the Asians saw it? Was there any media consensus?
I wouldn't say there was a media consensus, but one thing that you would not do in Asia is to view the EU-China agreement through the lens of Washington, which is precisely what all of the, kind of Western press has done, is to say, how dare Europe do this without getting Biden's approval first? And even some Europeans have done that. And quite frankly, my reaction is it any wonder that the European negotiators don't bother to listen to think tanks and the press, because all they've done is to poo-poo an agreement that was obviously under negotiation for a very, very long time.
Right.
And as you stated, is a partial fulfillment. Again, these are just milestones in a much broader process of Asian commercial convergence. And the Europeans do feel, they do believe in this principle. This is the German phrasing, Wandel durch Handel, right? So transformation through trade. And this has been Merkel's, stated objective. This is also something she wants to be her legacy. She was also thinking about having this agreement, signed prior to her own internal party transition. So they had their own internal motivations for doing this that didn't have anything necessarily to do with the Biden administration. Did doing it before Biden could necessarily hold them up play a role? Of course it did. There's no question. But does Europe have its own increasingly tangible self-definition of its interests? Yes, it does. And it does include ensuring that they have that reciprocal access to Chinese markets, that their banks are able to get in and have a larger market share than American banks, and that they pursue greater trade and exports across Asia.
Yes.
And and their approach to that is, quite frankly, the approach that I support, which is to directly engage with, create a level playing field with, and compete with China.
And that ties in directly to what you've espoused for a long time: the three big powers, the influencers of the future: U.S., the EU, and Asia. But let me ask you: you have said that the biggest risk of conflict in the 21st century stems from not settling the conflicts of the 20th century. South China, CETA. What did you mean by that?
Well, we know that Asia is sort of littered with World War III scenarios, right? And we've seen any number of them percolating episodically in recent years, whether it is between India and China, Taiwan, South China Sea, Senkaku Islands, North Korea, Taiwan, you name it. So the thing is that, of course, as you know, many of these are if not ancient and pre-colonial, are certainly colonial or post-colonial in terms of border demarcations that were never fully ratified or agreed or accepted on both sides, and are therefore to some degree also pre-legal. And pre-legal is one of the operative terms here, because even the accepted or if you will, codified boundaries of states when they became members of the United Nations formally, and to the extent that international law is deepened its role as an arbitrator of international boundary disputes since 1945, it doesn't. These countries therefore accept the status quo of that period of time, 1945, as the legitimate boundaries.
Right.
So you have to go back to, so I don't think there, and that's why what you have found with the International Tribunal at The Hague's decision backing the Philippines, jurisdiction over disputed Spratly Islands has not really been recognized by China.
Right.
They couldn't care less, right?
Yeah.
And other disputes similarly are considered pre-legal, or in colonial era. So I do believe that one has to use more of a kind of creative, bilateral, and what I've called a sort of technocratic approach to solving these disputes, rather than believing that legal proceedings based on contemporary international law are going to solve them. We've tried that. So I've advocated a kind of step-by-step process, which is generally sort of done in an almost secret format. And that has a kind of, international mediation, but more or less allows for the commitment to abide by a decision that will be made in the future by negotiators behind closed doors, such that whether a regime is, present or still incumbent in power in the future, it will not face the backlash, if you will, from the outcome of that, and not be viewed as having made excessive concessions because the agreement was made prior to that government being in power. And that's more or less one of the only ways you can get around the dilemma of the need for governments to save face and to appear to have prevailed in these kinds of negotiations. Otherwise, again, you run the risk that a Cold War becomes a hot war. At any moment. And I would find that not only tragic, but obviously lamentable and silly, given how trivial the actual geographies at stake here are.
Got it. It's we're heading into our allotted time, but I want to give you a chance. I have one more question, but I do want to give you a few minutes to talk about your new book. And I must say, the title and short descriptions that you've put out there, it just makes it so exciting. But I want to end on this note. If you were to put a position paper with an agenda for the new Biden administration, Asia, and especially China, what might be the three most important items that you would put on it, Parag?
Well, I would say let's start with the sort of framing or the framework and the objective. And the key is to create, to deepen what I've called the geopolitical marketplace, right? To enable countries to have options for whom they trade with, take investment from, and have military relations with, beyond China. And that requires not just idle exhortations of countries not to fall into debt traps. It requires active competition to be a substitute provider for that country, for their infrastructure finance, for their 5G and telecom networks, or whatever the case may be. And what I've found thus far is that it's been a lot more talk than action. And action is truly more important than words when it comes to this issue. So actively competing with China for the friendships, loyalties, and service provision to these emerging powers or underdeveloped countries is going to be the way in which to not, I would say, prevail, but to ensure that China remains, the most powerful country in Asia, yes, but not the hegemon of Asia. And that would be a desirable outcome. But it's not going to happen, again, by writing lots of telegrams, whether they are long or whether they are longer. It's actually going to happen through genuine engagement country by country. Now, again, this is one of the areas where I do see incipient efforts that I do support, whether it's the Quad, whether it is the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, whether it is the T10 around technology coalitions. All of these are genuinely sensible measures. And this is where the full force of diplomatic effort should go. When it comes to the hot geopolitical territorial issues, again, it should be around resolution, not just on maintenance of a balance of forces, because that always opens the door to accidental escalation and conflict. So I'm strongly of the view that conflicts need to be settled, not just prolonged and postponed.
Now, let's talk about your new book, and tell us the title. And it seems to be a slight tangent from what you've been working on, but I don't think it is actually.
No, it's not. The book is called Move, and it is actually fundamentally about human geography. And as you know, geography is my passion. So
Yes.
this book is a sequel to Connectography. So Connectography was about the functional geography of infrastructure and how it reshapes geopolitics and economics. And what I wanted to do was to answer the simple question, which is, where will the 9 billion people of the world physically reside in the year 2030, 2040, and 2050?
Right.
And if you can answer that question, which is a very big if, because it's a very multidisciplinary undertaking, but if you can come up with answers to that question, you will know a lot about the future of the world economy, because where there are people, that's where there will be economic activity.
Yes.
You will know a lot about technology, about how we cope with climate change, and about new coalitions and alliances between countries based upon the movements of people. So I'm using human geography, which is a very formal discipline, as a lens into the future of basically everything. So
and
that
when
is
does the book come out?
That book will be published in early October of this year.
All right. Well, you have a standing invitation to talk to Polaris-Live about your new book when you find the time. And listen, Dr. Khanna, listen, Parag, this talking to you is getting a PhD in Asian and geopolitics in general. So I can't thank you enough for appearing, giving this time. This morning, late hour in Singapore. It was really very nice of you. I learned a lot, and I'm sure all the viewers learned a lot. And so I wanted again to say thank you.
Thank you, Sarwar. Such a pleasure to see you again, and thanks for the delightful conversation.